Welcome back to Genetics in the Paddock with Emily. I'm your host, Emily Johnston, and I'll be taking you along on my journey to learn about all things genetics in extensive livestock. Today's guest speaker is Tracie Bird-Gardiner, a Development Officer from New South Wales Department of Primary Industries and Regional Development. In this episode, we'll dive into the challenges and opportunities of breeding breech strike-resistant merino sheep. Join us as we explore genetic solutions, alternative management practices, and the future of sustainable sheep production in Australia. Welcome back to another episode of Genetics in the Paddock with Emily. Today I'm joined by Tracie Bird-Gardiner, who's one of my colleagues. So thank you so much, Tracie, for sitting down to have a chat with me today about some topics that are going to be very interesting to discuss. So Tracie, I might get you to just do a bit of an intro about you. I mean, I guess I could do a bit of a summary, but I think you'll do it a lot better than I will. So if you just want to give me a bit of a rundown about your background and what you currently do at the department.
I started working in agriculture when I was a teenager and worked in various aspects from beef, sheep, goats, crops, and I have travelled around a fair bit in New South and a bit of Queensland and Victoria working in agriculture. I later came and worked with Training Research Station and have been based here ever since. That's about it. Besides, at the moment I'm working with the Low Methane Beef Project and I'm also working on the Measured Goat Project, which are both genetic projects for the genetics unit.
Okay, that sounds really interesting, Tracie. Sounds like you've had quite a diverse background and a lot of experience in a lot of different areas. And from knowing you personally, I know that you're quite passionate about sheep. And I know we've had a few conversations off camera about sheep as well. And I know you've done a fair bit of work in this space. So I guess I kind of wanted to sit down and talk to you today a little bit more about that. So just as a bit of a set the scene for what we're going to talk about today, can you explain what breech strike is and why it's such a significant issue for the sheep industry?
I've got an interest in fly strike and breech strike in Merino sheep particularly because I did a research master's in it. So I've always been very passionate about sheep. So breech strike is where the breech area of the sheep is infested with eggs and larvae, predominantly from the sheep blowfly, Leucilia caprina, which causes production losses. It can cause chronic disease and it can kill sheep as well. It's a significant issue for the industry and it's been estimated to be between the second and the fifth largest cost to the Australian sheep industry. And that cost estimate depends on what model and data they've used to derive the expenses. So it is quite a significant issue for the industry.
Absolutely, and I'm sure it's a problem that a lot of producers battle with and face. So I guess mulesing is one of the main methods that people have used to control breech strike. So what are the main reasons for some of the increasing pressure at the moment to stop this practice, and what other methods are there that are currently being researched to help with breech strike?
Well, mulesing has been considered by industry as well as public and animal welfare groups as being cruel.
Yep.
Particularly the welfare groups in Europe have been putting increasing pressure on the wool manufacturers and retailers to stop using wool from mule sheep.
Okay.
They've used extensive graphic publicity to gain consumer support on this.
Yep.
So the merino industry has been looking at continuing research to find alternative methods to control breech strike. Some of those at the moment include modelling to implement integrated pest management systems which suit specific environments.
Yeah.
There's been more current research on tracking the progression of chemical resistance in flies across the various regions in Australia because that problem is just building all the time. There's the ongoing research into trying to develop a vaccine for sheep against fly strike. And more recently as well, there's been some genomic and genetic research into identifying genes that indicate sheep that are resistant to fly strike and breech strike. And then there's been another stream of work where they're looking at odour profiles in sheep.
Okay.
They're the most current ones that I'm aware of at the moment.
So it sounds like there's a lot going on at the moment to try and look for some alternative methods, because as you said, it sounds like there's a lot of pressure to move away from mulesing. So in terms of genetics, how heritable is breech strike resistance in sheep? And what does it mean for the potential to breed sheep resistant to breech strike?
Well, breech strike heritability is actually a little bit environment dependent.
Okay.
Because what we've found is that in non-seasonal environments, the heritability has ranged from, say, 0.1 to 0.3. In summer dominant rainfall, you're looking at about 0.3. And then in your winter dominant rainfall areas, the estimates have been between 0.4 and nearly 0.6. But what you've got to understand is those estimates vary because of the way the heritabilities have been estimated.
Yeah.
Because fly strike is often modelled as a binary trait, like 0 or 1.
Okay.
It can be analysed as a continuous trait, like similar to a body weight, and it can be modelled as a continuous trait on the observed scale, or it can be as a binary trait on the underlying scale as well. So that's why we're getting such variation in heritabilities as well. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the really good thing is, irrespective of all that modelling and how people get a heritability estimate, it's great that it's actually been identified as a heritable trait.
Mm-hmm.
So that means that it can be selected for, and we can breed sheep that are resistant to fly strike, which means we can eventually stop mulesing. We don't have to crutch, and we won't need chemicals to control breech strike. So that's the really good news.
Yeah, that is really good, and it sounds like some of these alternative methods that are being researched are going to have a really great benefit into the future. So we spoke a bit about just then how the environment can affect breech strike. So what are some of the challenges in identifying animals that are susceptible to breech strike under these different environmental conditions?
Well, the issue with breech strike is it's not expressed in every environment every year. So it makes it difficult to identify susceptible animals under different management regimes, because a lot of places actually manage their sheep so that there's no expression of fly strike.
Okay.
And then you've also got the fact that depending on what environment you're in will also determine how long the flies are active. So like in the non-seasonal rainfall zone, they have the longest period in a year where sheep can become fly struck.
Okay.
Whereas the winter rainfall zone, it's actually a shorter period of the year that those animals can get fly struck. And that's just basically due to the environment and the cold weather or the hot weather and the amount of rainfall. Breech strike is not easy to measure, like measuring a fleece weight or something. So you've got that environmental problem as well, as that you just can't go out and decide, I'm just going to go and measure breech strike susceptibility today.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the time, the animals, even though they are susceptible, they're not showing that expression.
Right.
So that makes it a difficult trait as well. Yeah.
So what are some of the indicator traits for breech wrinkle, and what makes them effective indicators?
I've found that indicator traits, which are traits that provide an indirect selection method, are breech wrinkle, neck wrinkle, body wrinkle, urine stone, dag, and breech cover. They're just a few of them.
Yeah.
And what makes them a good trait as an indicator trait is that they've got to have a high genetic correlation with the trait that you're trying to improve. They need to be scored or measured at various ages, and can be scored or recorded under a normal management system, and they need to be highly variable traits as well.
Yeah. So you just mentioned then the concept of indirect selection. So can we just touch on that a little bit, and can you explain what that means and how we can use that to improve traits like resistance to breech strike, particularly because you said it's not something that you can measure all the time and it's not something that's always an occurrence. So how can we use indirect selection to do that?
Indirect selection is where a trait that's difficult to measure, like fly strike, makes it almost impossible for industry to select on that trait alone. So we find a trait that's highly correlated with that expression and is easily measured. So that's why a trait like breech wrinkle has been chosen, because it's one of the most highly correlated traits with the expression of breech strike that we've found to date, so that you can consistently every year go and record sheep's wrinkle score, whereas you can't do that for fly strike. So that's why we use another trait that's related to improve the trait that we want to measure.
Right, that makes sense. So how does, and going back to the whole environment thing again, because we were talking before about how some animals are susceptible for longer periods because of the rainfall. So how does the environment affect the expression of breech strike? Is it just that it's at higher incidence, or does it affect the expression of it in potentially a different way?
Well, it does. Breech strikes also, depending on the environment, depends on the indicator traits or that are useful for that environment. Okay. So like in the winter dominant rainfall zone, dags and urine stain were identified as the best indicator traits for that environment. But then in the summer dominant rainfall zone, breech wrinkle was identified as the best indicator trait to select for to reduce breech strike. And then in the non-seasonal rainfall zone, breech wrinkle was also identified as a key indicator trait, whereas dags was not a key indicator trait, because in the summer dominant rainfall zone and the non-seasonal rain, dags is just not expressed on a consistent basis, and it has a low heritability in those environments, so it was not a suitable trait. So it's interesting that depending on the environment that your sheep are run in will depend on which are the best traits for you to use.
Yeah. That is very interesting, because I guess it comes back to how much the environment does affect your production system, and just knowing that really well if you do want to use genetics to potentially lower the risk of fly strike and breech strike. So when we're talking visual traits, are there any sort of correlations between, wrinkle and cover scores and breech strike, and can these at all influence like breeding and selection decisions?
Yeah. Well, the genetic correlations that we've found between, say, dag and breech strike have varied between like 0.3 to 0.8. For breech wrinkle, 0.1 to 0.65. So there's been a bit of variation. Neck wrinkle, 0 to 0.4. The phenotypic correlations are lower than the genetic correlation with breech strike. Those correlations are also environment dependent as to how and when they were measured. The phenotypic correlations are low, indicating that like an animal may not visually appear to be susceptible, but it is genetically more prone than what you're able to see.
Okay, yeah.
So that's an interesting thing as well. So like you might look at an animal and think, it looks as though it's going to be really highly susceptible to breech strike because it's got huge wrinkles or something, but that's not necessarily the case, because you can have an animal that's got a large breech wrinkle score and never ever get struck in its life. So that's one of the reasons why your genetic correlations and your phenotypic or your visual are not the same.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I guess what are some of the practical challenges, and maybe that's one of them, but what are some of the practical challenges of implementing genetic selection for breech strike resistance in sheep breeding programs?
Well, there's the issue that the indirect selection traits are not always favourably correlated with production traits.
Okay.
So that's an issue that has to be taken into consideration, because basically the key indicator trait that has been implemented in a selection index for industry is breech wrinkle, but it's unfavourably correlated with fleece weight and fibre diameter.
Okay.
So if you reduce breech wrinkle, the correlation is saying that you're going to reduce fleece weight and increase micron. So that's why it's really important that these indicator traits are included and used in an index, selection index, because otherwise you're not going to end up with the right outcome that you're chasing, I don't think.
Yeah, that makes sense, because I was just about to ask you about why might we try and avoid using single trait selection, because I imagine a lot of people want to try and select for breech strike resistance, but again, there's probably a lot more to think about. As you said, there's correlations with the traits. So is this kind of like an example of why you shouldn't be using single trait selection and potentially looking at using indexes to make sure things are balanced and moving in the right direction that you need them to be going to still be profitable and align with your production system?
Yeah, that's right, exactly. I mean, if you just selected purely on breech wrinkle, I'd say it wouldn't take very long before you'd have a very plain flock, but the consequences of what's going to happen to all your other production traits would not be good due to correlations. I'm 99.9% sure, off the top of my head, all those indexes, actually, every one of them has breech wrinkle in it.
So basically all of the indexes at the moment include breech wrinkle?
Yes, they do.
So what further research do you think we need to enhance the understanding and application of genetic selection for breech strike resistance, particularly in terms of correlated responses with production traits and wool quality traits?
Well, they're still pursuing the vaccine, but I think they need to do further research on maybe the actual cause of breech strike.
Okay.
Which is a bit left-wing, I know that, but these indicator traits that we're using at the moment, the correlations between the trait and breech strike are not one. So, it's only an association. So, sheep can have dags and never get struck. It's not, so you can't say that dags is actually causing breech strike. It contributes to it in some animals, and that's the same with all the other indicator traits. So I think there's scope for further research in different areas, looking at different traits that might be easy to measure. Maybe some of the odour profiles, there's been a bit of work done on that recently, because some of the research showed that dogs could actually pick up by scent sheep that were resistant and susceptible to fly strike.
Oh, wow.
And that was validated by some research work.
Yeah.
That's an area which I think has potential, and that combined with genomics, I think will be our key way going forward. Because realistically, the easiest way for industry would be through genomics. Because being able to have a resource flock that measures and collects fly strike resistance costs a lot of money, a hell of a lot of money, because it means that the animals would not be used if they had preventative treatment on them for fly strike. You're not getting that full expression of susceptibility. So it would take a lot to manage a flock like that for industry.
Yeah, definitely. No, that's a good point there, Tracie, and some really interesting insights, particularly on some of the work that's been done. I have never heard about the dogs before, so that was really cool to hear. I didn't know they were doing that sort of work in this space. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. So you've worked in the industry for a little while now, and I guess you've worked across, a lot of different industries, and one of the ones that we've covered in this episode is mostly to do with sheep. So what do you think the next 10 years looks like for the industry? I love asking people at the end of the episode what they think the future might hold. So yeah, I'm keen to hear what you think as well.
I think the next 10 years is going to be rather challenging under the current environment on an international scale due to climate change challenges, carbon trading challenges, the fact that the agricultural industry has been sort of earmarked as a contributor to greenhouse gases, irrespective of species. I think the industry will probably consolidate a little bit at the moment, but I think by the end of the 10 years, with new markets developed, I think the industry will have a good outlook.
Thanks for sharing that, Tracie. I think that'll be really interesting to keep an eye on, and I love the positive been at the end where you think it's going to have a good outlook. I think that's always good to hear. We definitely want to keep these industries going as long as we can. So thank you so much today, Tracie, for talking to me about a lot of these really interesting topics. I know personally I've learnt so much, and I'm sure everyone listening has as well, because this is a very interesting topic, and a lot of people likely struggle with this. As you said, it's one of the biggest issues in the sheep industry. So thank you so much for sharing all of your insights and some of your research as well, because it's been fantastic, and I've really enjoyed having a chat with you.
Thanks, Emily. Same, I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. And that brings us to the end of this episode of Genetics in the Paddock with Emily. I hope you found our discussion as enlightening as I did. This episode was produced by the extensive livestock genetics team within the New South Wales Government. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing to our podcast on your favourite platform, leaving us a review and sharing it with your friends and colleagues. Your feedback and support help us grow and reach more people who are passionate about livestock genetics. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for future topics or people you'd like to hear on the show, please feel free to reach out to me on emily.johnston@dpi.newsouthwales.gov.au. Thanks again for listening, and until next time.